Hi, everyone, and welcome to the new Behind the Numbers show, Reimagining Retail, an eMarketer podcast made possible by mParticle. I'm your host, Insider Intelligence Principal Analyst, Andrew Lipsman. Today is Wednesday, April 13th, and you're listening to the new bi-weekly show that will talk all about how retail is colliding with every part of our lives and what happens next. Let's begin today's show with our opening segment. What does this have to do with retail? Where I take a look at a recent headline that you didn't think had anything to do with retail, but actually does. Today's headline comes from the New York Times on March 29th. Nielsen agrees to $16 billion private equity takeover. The media measurement giant, which has struggled to navigate the shift to digital viewing and was stripped of its MRC accreditation last year in the wake of COVID-related panel management issues, will now have the opportunity to retool its measurement system without public market scrutiny. So what does this have to do with retail? As the TV measurement wars heat up, with ComScore, VideoAmp, and others vying for currency status, new systems are being architected with impression-level measurement at their center. Rather than being constrained by the relatively modest sample sizes of a panel of about 40,000 households, future of measurement is going to be based on individual impressions that will not only describe viewing behavior across screens, but can also be tied, obviously in an anonymized and privacy-friendly manner, to sales outcomes at the store. And nothing moves ad budgets faster than clarity in attributing sales. So expect a sea change in the coming years as the TV measurement ecosystem evolves. Now, speaking of attribution, let's get to today's episode. How D2C brands are dealing with Facebook attribution dilution. We're going to discuss how Apple's recent iOS changes are shaking up targeting and measurement, and where D2C brands' digital ad budgets are flowing as a result. I'll be joined first for Talking Shop with Sarah Livingston, head of customer solutions at Rockerbox, a marketing measurement platform that measures over $1.5 billion in annual ad spend for D2C brands. Sarah is an expert in the inner workings of digital ad targeting and measurement, with some very interesting data and insights to share about the changes happening with D2C brand budgets today. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. Excited to talk about this.
So, Sarah, let's talk first about Rockerbox. Tell us a little bit about the company and your role at the company.
Definitely. You teed it up really well. Hundreds of the leading D2C and e-commerce companies currently leverage Rockerbox's SaaS platform to have a holistic measurement solution and foundational data sets, spanning everything from digital to offline channels and paid and organic as well. Ultimately, unlocking faster optimization, budgeting, and customer insights to enable them to shift to a data-driven marketing org and continue to scale. And to what you hit on earlier, this is more important than ever. And I head up customer solutions where my fantastic teams and I are responsible for ensuring our clients are equipped and empowered to leverage Rockerbox to do this. And we work with brands, everyone from seed to IPO and beyond, giving us a front row seat to watch our clients grow as a business, evolving their marketing mix and analytical maturity. And it's pretty rewarding for us to know that we're facilitating a tiny part of this growth, bringing them transparency into marketing performance to make faster decisions. Exactly what you hit on earlier, needing to have transparency and clarity into what marketing spend is driving sales is critical for them to continue to operate. This also puts us in an extremely advantageous position to get to see trends across brands at every stage of growth, which leads us to having this insight around the impact of iOS changes to Facebook and the evolving ways marketing mixes change across different brands over the last year and a half.
Yeah, well, so we're living amidst a huge disruption and dislocation in ad spend for D2C brands. And you and I have talked quite a bit offline and frankly geeked out on a lot of the data. I mean,
derogatory term. That's a derogatory term. We had fun discussing in detail measurement shifts.
Yes, we have. We have gone deep on data and understanding the way that budgets are flowing. And I think that anytime there's really rapid and disruptive change, it's a chance to shed light on the situation. So, You work with a lot of different D2C brand clients, as you mentioned. The iOS changes went into effect really in Q2 of last year, and it caused some pretty immediate disruption to how these brands were seeing their Facebook ads perform. Talk us a bit through that moment in time. What happened? What were your clients seeing? And what was their initial reaction?
Definitely. And it's crazy to think back then to like that April time period, because there's just, and even before then, just because there was so much fear across all the brands. Fear coming from uncertainty on them not knowing what the impact of the iOS changes would be, when it would hit, and how it would hit. And to stop and think of how it really all played out, which was changes started to roll out. The initial rollout happened in April, but we really didn't see the impact to the shift in ad spend until July. And this was, of course, due to consumer adoption of actually upgrading their operating system, and then the impact it had to both targeting pools on Facebook as well as measurement on Facebook. And it was really that July timeframe when we started to see those budgets pull back from Facebook. And this is, of course, us looking at over 1.5 billion in annual spend from brands across sizes, everyone from Tula Skincare, Aura Rings, Tracksmith, Rhone, Noble Athletic Apparel, Fig Scrubs. And when we look at this brand cohort in aggregate, what we saw was that pre-iOS changes, about 35% of spend was going towards Facebook. Right as the changes happened, so that April to June timeframe, about 31% of total spend was still going to Facebook. But then when we saw those changes truly hit, that July to October timeframe dropped to 28% of total spend. So we're going from 35% pre-iOS changes to 28% in July after those changes truly hit and had an impact. And then, of course, different story with holiday, where spend started to rebound just because you had small brands needing places for rapid scale. And then this becomes an important differentiating factor. So there's stats just looking at total spend, but then we started to see big differences across brands of different sizes, whereby you had your smallest brands that were the most just overexposed on Facebook, which we'll get into, shifting their spend, of course, to Google and Google's continued dominance. But on the other end of the spectrum, you had your larger, more mature brands. So these are your Series D, IPO, public companies who had already heavily diversified their marketing mix and had in 2020 tested into offline channels like direct mail, OTT, with otherwise streaming TV, and linear TV for the first time, and had proven out those channels. So then when the Facebook started to have adverse performance, they already had a diversified marketing mix and had channels that weren't subjected to mobile targeting that they could scale against, so that that cohort of larger brands immediately began to shift that spend into those offline channels, which had the dual benefit of these channels also having a lot more instant scale. So you had the large brands that had already tested out these offline channels shift spend into it. And then your medium or even larger brands that hadn't tested those offline channels start testing it for the first time. And that's where you really saw that spend going when people pulled from Facebook, which was, it was completely dependent on the size of their business and the channels that they had already tested out.
So just to illuminate the data for our audience, this jumped out at me when I took a look at it, was that basically you saw a more precipitous shift in spend away from Facebook from the smaller brands and the larger brands, and the mid-sized ones stayed a little bit more static with their spend. You tend to not see those things, kind of shift from the two opposite ends of the spectrum, but you're starting to illuminate exactly why that is. So talk a little bit more about the small brands. As you said, they were pretty over leveraged on Facebook. So what was it like through their eyes? And then talk again about the larger brand impact and how and why they were able to diversify a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard for a small D2C. There are no two ways about it. They've proven product market fit, if you will, for the brand, but at the same time have not raised that Series B plus, whereas they're still having to be extremely fiscally conservative for a D2C, which means have a true, clear return on ad spend or ROAS target. And for a lot of them, they were able to very quickly achieve this on Facebook, Instagram at a decent amount of scale. As a result, they were over leveraged on that channel and had much more spend going to Facebook than any other channel because they didn't have a need to diversify. Also, when you're that small and you're that lean, you don't have a large marketing team. You're talking anywhere from 2 to 6 people. So you physically don't have the resources to test into other channels, nor did you need to because your core channels of Facebook and then Google were performing really well. So when iOS rolled out and they started to see adverse impact to Facebook, they were the most at risk because they were the most overextended. They were running the widest targeting pools, the longest look back windows, and giving Facebook the most flexibility. Also, because they were running the least number of channels, they were least susceptible to the duplication that you see by running across lots of channels, where each vendor is taking 100% credit for every conversion that they touch. We'll get into that a bit more in the benefits of deduplicated attribution. But again, you go back to these smaller brands, and they were the most overextended and overexposed on Facebook, which is why it hit them the hardest. And at that point, when you're a small brand, you also have limited, so like we talked about, limited bandwidth to test more channels. You also have limited creative capacity. So it's not like you can just spin up a video asset and all of a sudden start running on TV, nor do you have the budget to do that. But instead, what they had already had was they were already running non-branded search and non-branded shopping. Non-branded, of course, being terms that aren't the name of your brand. So think like comfiest running shorts or best sweat wicking running shirt. So they already had some campaigns set up there. And this was a nice forcing function to go back to basics, put their head down and really do what's not considered to be sexy or cool, but vital, and build out those non-branded campaigns across Google. And Google has also made it very easy to scale here. So you really had all of these smaller brands immediately going to Google. Then to what we hit on earlier, when you think about those larger brands, they're in a much more advantageous position. Not only do they have a lot more money and a lot larger teams, but as a result of that and needing to scale already, they've had to diversify their marketing mix, which means they weren't only running on Facebook and Google, and they weren't already overexposed on Facebook because they had already hit a natural point of diminishing returns, which forced them to diversify their marketing mix. For most of them, that happened at the start of the pandemic in 2020, where you also saw a drop in rates across OTT and linear TV, which made it more palatable for them to test into that. So they already had a year and a half leg up of testing and then scaling into offline channels. So when they saw that drop in Facebook performance, they knew exactly where they could easily shift budgets. And in fairness, we are in a very advantageous position for the hundreds of brands that use Rockerbox because they already had clear measurement across all of these channels. So there was no second guessing what the ROAS was. And they were able to very quickly know what that baseline performance was across other channels and be able to very quickly shift budget without having to first say, wait, what does the Facebook ROAS mean compared to a TV ROAS? They already had those baselines.
So the ROAS, right? It comes down in a lot of cases just looking at that ROAS number. You're looking across channels. You're a small brand. A lot of them might just be Facebook and Google, and that's it, right? So if your Facebook ROAS gets broken, well, where is it going to go? It doesn't really have anywhere else to go if you're going to keep spending than Google. If you're looking across 6 or 7 channels as one of these big brands, you know where your next dollar needs to go. You just stack rank where your ROAS is, and you kind of shift into that direction. Is that right?
That's spot on. And there's a really big counter argument out there, which is if you know you need, let's say, a 1.5 return on ad spend to break even, why are you ever spending below that? So there's another school of thought, an argument that says, all right, Facebook performance implodes, but as soon as that, no matter what, as soon as that ROAS falls below 1.5, you should stop spending. And if you're in a non-growth business and you're just trying to maintain a steady state, that's completely valid. But the truth is the majority of D2C and e-commerce companies have raised venture or PE funds and are trying to be in a hyper growth stage, which means even if that return on ad spend is not as high as they need it to be, they're going to continue to spend in because they need to fuel and drive that growth.
So we've talked a bit about Google. Clearly, they were an early beneficiary of budgets shifting. We saw that pretty clearly in the Q4 performance, right? Facebook struggled and Google's ad numbers were surprisingly strong. Your data certainly underscores that point. Brands are diversifying beyond Google. That's the biggest pool of spend. But let's talk a little bit about some of these other channels. Where are those budgets flowing? You've mentioned a few of them, but more specifically, are you noticing any channels perform especially well and that there's excitement and maybe some momentum behind those channels?
Definitely. I mean, we've already hit on offline channels, which makes sense for the larger brands. But when we look across all brands, the biggest standout has been TikTok. And it's just incredibly impressive to watch a channel that has gone from under 0.2% of total spend a year ago to now upwards of 2% just in the last year. And TikTok has become an absolute beast in terms of performance, not just performance in terms of looking at that return on ad spend, but also performance in being able to reach a net new audience, which is absolutely critical when you go back to thinking about all of these brands being in growth mode. Growth mode means in order to acquire net new customers, they have to reach net new people. And it's one thing to reach people at the optimal frequency, so right number of impressions across existing ad platforms. But if they're going to continue to grow, they have to find ways to reach net new audiences. And what we see across our hundreds of brands when we look at TikTok performance is not only is it hitting those ROAS targets, but they're reaching users that they previously weren't reaching across any platform, be it Facebook, be it Google, be it OTT, be it streaming audio, which is why it's so exciting when we look at TikTok and the upside against TikTok as we look ahead to this year and especially even into holiday 2022.
So more recently, you mentioned or alluded to the fact that Facebook regained some share around the holiday season. There's been some talk of late that maybe Facebook is clawing back some budgets. Maybe they're working through some of the measurement issues. What do you see as the current state of affairs there? Are they kind of fighting back against that lost momentum, or is it more of a temporary blip?
Definitely. I think it's important to contrast Facebook and seeing Facebook regain budgets we'll go back to TikTok and TikTok's growth trajectory. Because for TikTok to continue to scale, it's an uphill but achievable battle in that TikTok needs to build out more targeting, which is on the way. They also have to solve their creative problem, which is right now, brands spend a lot of resources trying to figure out how to make creative work on TikTok. And then once they figure that out, it's gangbusters, fantastic performance for a little bit. And then that creative quickly wears and they have to produce more and more creative. So there's still an uphill to make TikTok work at scale. But you contrast that with Facebook, and the reason budgets are so easily able to flow back into Facebook is because for the most part, brands have figured out that creative component of Facebook. And now it's just about rebaselining Facebook to the new normal. And what that means is if you go back to where we started the conversation around them having inflated ROASs on Facebook. So what brands have done is rebaseline and reset those targets. And then off of those new targets, able to say, okay, now what can we spend and effectively retest back into Facebook? But the platform itself and the mechanics of the platform haven't changed. The creative that works hasn't changed. It's just the targeting and the scalability of the targeting that's changed. And then by extension, what that ROAS looks like, which is why it's so easy to go and rescale an incumbent than it is compared to testing and then scaling something new.
Now you mentioned in your response there, inflated ROAS on Facebook. Can you talk a bit about what you mean there? I mean, I guess one of the questions that I've wondered here as we've seen the disruption of measurement and targeting data is, are Facebook ads as effective as they seem? Or to what extent maybe is Facebook similar to Google? Google's been accused of, sort of last click attribution, taking credit for a lot of value that the ads might not actually create. To what extent do you think Facebook ads might also be very good at taking credit for conversions where it's not clear that they had, all or maybe only deserve some of the credit?
I mean, there's no two ways about it. That is definitely true. Facebook ads do work. It's just a matter of how relatively well they work and what that true return on ad spend is. So like in Facebook's lens, Facebook only tracks Facebook and at the same time takes 100% credit for every single Facebook ad that a user sees on a path to conversion, which is what causes that inflated ROAS. A very classic example is we could pick a small Shopify brand. They log into Shopify and they know they drove 1,000 purchases yesterday. But they log into Facebook Ad Manager and Facebook's going to tell them Facebook drove 800. They log into Google AdWords and Google's going to tell them they drove 400. Well, they well know they drove 1,000, not 1,200. But both those Facebook and Google ads are taking credit for every conversion that ad was a touch point on. And that's a small brand. To the example earlier, if you take a brand that's running across 8 channels, that increases incrementally. So first, what happens is just by the nature of each ad platform only tracking their own activity, you have duplication, and duplication leads to that inflated ROAS. That happens to be particularly exacerbated on Facebook because of brands running large scale targeting like top and mid funnel placements that reach a high percent of users, so that anybody that sees one of those ads, they're taking credit for. And this obviously compounded with wider targeting and wider look back windows to take credit for those placements pre-iOS changes. And then what you had was, with the iOS rollout, the contraction in tracking led to both a contraction in the available users to target, as well as Facebook pulling out what used to be the ability for them to take credit for anyone that saw an ad within 28 days of converting, to instead rein that in and say, no, we're only going to take credit for 1 day. Mind you, even in that 1 day, what's called an attribution or look back window, they're still taking credit for every single person that saw that Facebook ad and then ultimately converted. So no matter what, anytime an ad platform is only tracking its own activity, it's going to have duplicated performance. And in fairness, admittedly, and I guess not to plug, like this is the reason that so many brands leverage Rockerbox, is because we can take that and deduplicate it and say, for every user that converts, deduplicate it to every single marketing touch point that drove that conversion. So they're not having to look at all credit to Facebook and all credit to Google, but understand the sequence of those touch points on a true user path to conversion and distribute credit accordingly.
So a lot of ROAS is probably overstated, in that if an ad platform can take credit for a sale, they're going to take 100% credit. But as you said, you can have Facebook and Google, just to oversimplify, both taking credit for that same sale. The reality is they're both probably deserving of some of the credit, just not all of that credit. But it's also interesting, as you mentioned, these look back windows, that if that 28-day window where you can expose somebody to a Facebook ad, they can convert, several weeks later. Facebook used to be able to take credit for that, and now they're not able to. So you can easily see how, if you're looking at it through the lens of a D2C brand, all of a sudden those sales that are happening, they're still happening, right? For the most part. It's just that they can't say, oh, that was attributed to Facebook.
Exactly. And honestly, that's for the best, because no one should have been running a 28-day view through look back window to begin with. And what the iOS changes, the upside of them is it brought a level of operational rigor and campaign management rigor that maybe a lot of people just didn't have because they didn't need to have, because they were able to just throw budgets at Facebook, say Facebook was auto-optimizing, and it was good enough.
Sarah, thanks for taking us into the weeds and understanding what I think is a really important issue. All right, it's time for a quick word from our sponsor, mParticle, and then we'll be right back.
At the end of the day, your customer has to be at the center of everything you do. This starts with the right customer data strategy, as well as the right foundation to solve the challenges that typically inhibit success, such as data quality, data governance, and connectivity. mParticle is your real-time customer data infrastructure that helps you accelerate your data strategy by cleansing, visualizing, and integrating your customer data from anywhere to anywhere. Ultimately, better data leads to better decisions, better customer experiences, and better outcomes. See why the best brands choose mParticle. Go to www.mparticle.com.
All right, Sarah, now it is time for our next segment, PopUp Rankings. In the first half of the show, we talked about what's happening with Facebook ad budgets and why. What our listeners want to really understand is what's going to happen next. So for today's pop-up ranking, we're going to get your thoughts on, if we forecast 3 years into the future, where do you see the top 3 places that you believe Facebook ad budgets are going to flow and why. So let's kick this ranking off in reverse order. Sarah, tell us what's number 3 on your list.
So first, and sorry to disappoint, I'm not going to say Web3 and NFTs. I know we have many that think that will be like the next great ad frontier. I think it's absolutely way too early. And you don't even have consumers there. Ad budgets are not flowing there.
10 years down the road, maybe we can talk about it. 3
maybe
years.
15. But yes, the most important thing when you think about where ad dollars are going to flow is where are consumers spending their time. And that's why number 3, without question, is TikTok. To what we already hit on, there are huge early indicators of this. Strong ad performance, ability for the brands that have figured out creative to optimize creative. We hit on a stat earlier that over the last year, percent of ad spend to TikTok has grown from like 0.2% to upwards of 2%. And you have macro trends again in its favor with growth of their daily and monthly active users. So, I mean, as long as brands continue to get the creative refreshes down and TikTok continues to invest in ad targeting, this is the most scalable of the social platform. And it's also like you talk about influencers, which is another almost offshoot channel that's going to grow. Influencers grow with these social platforms. So just like you had that eruption of influencers on Instagram over the prior 5 years, now you're seeing that happen on TikTok.
And just to paint a picture for our audience, the data that you mentioned there, going from about 0.2% to 2%, which is still a pretty modest sliver, especially in comparison to Facebook and Google, but it's the direction of it that's kind of eye-popping. I mean, it is really your classic hockey stick chart, and especially since the beginning of this year, it is up and to the right very quickly. So I'll be curious to see how that tracks over the next few months, especially.
Definitely. And I mean, if they can hold this, like to what we hit on earlier is once a brand has tested and proven, they're either going to hold budget at that level or grow budget. It's very likely for that budget to get clawed back if daily active and monthly active users are still growing, they're able to reach a net new audience. And we're seeing those indicators with TikTok. If we fast forward and look ahead to like holiday 2022, that's going to be the true litmus test. If brands are going to really dump funds and scale up TikTok in a way that they always do going back to Facebook.
And you also mentioned there's some friction points today, right? It's not the easiest lift to get creative. They still need to work on targeting and measurement, but those things are going to happen. And as those friction points get removed, right, it just makes it that much easier for budgets to flow.
Exactly.
Let's hear your number 2.
Yes, the number 2 goes to the complete other end of the spectrum. If TikTok is the newest, number 2 goes back to one of the oldest school channels there is in direct mail. And that's because it works. And direct mail is physically the postcards and catalogs that you get in the mail. This is a channel that's been rapidly growing for D2Cs over the last 2 years. Also had a big pop at the start of the pandemic with more people from home. It pulled a lot of budgets from those testing out of home ads. And the biggest drivers with direct mail is less clutter. There's less clutter for a younger person in their physical mailbox than email or SMS. There's also, thanks to newer companies here, instant scale and better targeting. You have companies that the majority of our clients work with, like Pebble Post and Posty, which have really lowered that barrier to entry. They take care of the creative, so turnkey creative, turnkey targeting. You have brands that the typical trajectory is they'll test in running some retargeting, so users that have come to their site not converted. Then they'll scale into lookalike audiences, so finding people similar to their highest value users. They'll prove those out with postcards. And then the oldest school of direct mail there is like physical multi-page catalogs, which will come back. And brands will run those during holiday and their key seasonal periods, not just to their highest value users to get them to buy more, but also is a really big reactivation play. Reactivation, something increasingly important for D2Cs as they mature. How can they take users that once bought and have stopped buying and get them to buy again? And that's where reaching them in low clutter, high impact environments like direct mail has proven to work so well, which is why I just see that as another channel that continues to scale. And we've seen that proven out across brands over the last 2 years.
And I love that old school marketing channels are coming back in vogue. They probably should never have gone out of style if they did at all. They work well like traditional media, but it's also highly measurable, right? And that's what D2C brands want.
Yes. It's been very interesting, at least for us, to be able to see that convergence and the impact of having both offline and digital touch points. People are funny. You can receive a direct mail and it'll have a 20% off promo code on it. That person doesn't use the promo code. Instead, they might search for your product or do a non-branded search, like again, comfiest jogging shorts. They'll click on the ad, then they'll do another search for the brand. They might get retargeted, and then they might go find an affiliate code and convert. That affiliate code being the same 20% off that they had in that direct mail. People are very funny. Thanks to great attribution and admittedly our ability to stitch all of that together, we're able to expose for the brand, oh, here was the impact that direct mail had. It actually drove that user into the funnel, even though they didn't use that promo code.
It's working as an awareness play. It's upper funnel.
100%.
And as you said, it's able to do that because it breaks through. In digital environments, you have so much clutter. There's no scarcity, but that good piece of direct mail you get in the mail, you actually might stop and look at and say, oh, this is a brand that's interesting to me.
Exactly.
Let's look at number one. Where is the number one bucket of spending that you see those Facebook budgets flowing 3 years from now?
And in fairness, I've combined two, old school, new school. So all things video, both linear TV, your traditional TV, as well as OTT and streaming TV. The biggest reason being scale and instant reach. So linear TV, the scale is inherently there, and it's cheaper than ever because you have an older demographic that's watching it. So for those D2Cs that in fact do target an older demo, it's perfect. And it's much lower CPMs, much more cost effective. And then the newer, of course, being OTT, over the top, and streaming TV. Going back to macro consumer trends, this is where the eyeballs are going. They're having a rapid growth here. So more supply, which is helping and makes CPMs more palatable. So you have both shift in consumer consumption, obviously more supply, more streaming services, making it easier to enter. And then the biggest opportunity when we talk about decreasing barriers to entry here is how can you get those mid and smaller brands into running streaming? How can you make it easier to create those creative assets to get them into this channel? And that will be the biggest opportunity for an accelerant to spend here. It's going to flow regardless because this is where the big brands are scaling their spend. But when you think what will for that longer tail rival Facebook is just making it as easy as possible to get those smaller brands to have video creative and be able to test at a lower budget to still prove out performance. But without question, we look 3 years ahead, we'll see the biggest year over year growth in TikTok, followed by direct mail, and then linear TV and streaming TV.
Yeah, and with streaming TV in particular, I think very much like direct mail, it works in an upper funnel manner, right? It's a great branding medium, but it's also more measurable. And I know that D2C brands love that measurability. A huge constraint has been lack of ad-supported inventory. So that's in the last year started to open up a lot more. But as you cast forward a few more years, I think we'll see enough inventory, and as you said, probably get to CPM that is easier for especially these smaller brands to digest.
Definitely.
Well, thank you. That's a great ranking. I think a great thing to leave our listeners with. That brings us to the end of today's show. Thank you, Sarah, so much for joining me for this fascinating conversation.
Definitely. As you know, I love chatting all things D2C marketing and analytics. So this was a blast.
Thank you to everyone who listened. We will be back in a few weeks with another episode of Reimagining Retail. Tune in tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by mParticle.